Hello, it's Alison here, welcoming you back to the Gardening by Design box of tricks, where we're talking about pruning small trees and shrubs. Part 3, Maintenance and Renovation. After Part 2, you should be more confident to guide your plants as they grow into the shape that you want, using the first 3 types of pruning. Here we will finish off with stabilization to maintain the size, and recovery and regeneration for when you need to renovate a mature plant. And we start with the pruning that, along with housekeeping, you are likely to do the most frequently, stabilization. Once a shrub reaches the size you want, you can prune it so that it just grows back to the same size each year without loss of flowers. This last point is key. It is surprisingly common for people to cut a shrub back to reduce the size and accept that they will always lose a year's flowers. But the good news is that once you understand what's happening, there is really no reason for this. Remember though that if you have to prune more than once a year, it is likely simply to be too big a shrub in too small a space. Bigger shrubs and large forest trees such as birch and oak are never going to be controlled by successful pruning. The first question to ask is, what are you growing the plant for? Just the flowers, for flowers and fruit and berries, or primarily the foliage, which is often coloured or variegated? This drives when and how you prune, and we will look at each of these in turn. You'll be pleased to know that stabilization pruning for flowering shrubs is pretty simple now that you know the basics of pruning. The key question is, when does your plant flower? In spring, which is any time up to May, or in summer, which is any time from June onwards. Spring flowering shrubs flower in spring, obviously, and then they grow through the summer to produce the wood that will flower the following spring. Summer flowering shrubs grow new flowering wood through the spring and then flower in the summer of the same year on that new growth. You need to prune immediately before the growth period and remove the previous year's wood so that the plant simply grows back to where it was. And it follows that spring flowering shrubs are pruned in early summer once the flowering has finished, and summer flowering shrubs are pruned in early spring before they start to grow after the winter. An example of a shrub that flowers at the end of spring is Weigela. When the leaves have fallen in the winter, you can clearly see in the yellow circle where I pruned out a flowering stem last June, just after the flowers faded. Through last summer, 3 or 4 shoots below the cut grew on strongly, and these will flower in the coming May. As soon as these flowers fade, these stems will in turn be pruned back, leaving just the lowest bud to break and grow on to flower the following year. Thus, the plant never grows any taller, and you have flowers every year. By the way, you can do any housekeeping pruning at the same time. By contrast, bush roses flower in June, and depending on the type, you may get further flowers through the summer if you keep on deadheading. As soon as the weather starts to warm up in March, I prune my bush roses down to a strong outward-facing bud and clear out any weak or crossing stems. This looks fairly drastic, but in fact I have just cut this rose back to where it started the previous spring, and by June it will once again be well over a metre high in time to start flowering. Spring flowering shrubs and trees that you grow for flowers and autumn berries or for fruit are pruned a little differently. If you prune back after spring flowering, as you would with the basic stabilization method, you will of course remove the berries or fruit from forming from the pollinated flowers. So instead, later in the summer, cut back the current year's extension growth by about 2/3, exposing the fruit but leaving some wood to flower next year, along with whatever further growth you get before the end of summer. You can clearly see the ripening fruit on this apple tree in the yellow oval, and the current year's vertical extension growth above, which is due for pruning any moment now. It's logical when you think about it. The tree flowered in spring with clusters of blossom on short spurs from the main branches like this picture. Through the summer, each twig has grown from the tip, leaving the flower and the fruit exactly where they were. Therefore, by cutting most of the current year's growth off in late summer, you keep the fruit at the same time as controlling the size of the tree. Pruning for ornamental shrubs grown for berries, such as the pyracantha shown here and cotoneaster, are treated exactly the same way. Cut back the new growth in late summer, leaving the berries. When you need to limit the overall height, you can cut further back, but then of course you will lose berries and flowers. So do this for about a third of the stems each year, and over the course of 3 years, you will reduce the whole height of the shrub and keep the display in the meantime. Maintaining the size of shrubs grown for foliage is very straightforward. If they are evergreen, cut them back in late summer to remove the current season's growth. This Photinia will produce some new bright red shoots immediately after pruning, with the main new growth occurring next spring, and then it will just regain its original height. For deciduous shrubs, cut them back in early spring so that you do not lose autumn colour. Again, you're aiming to take off 1 year's growth to maintain a stable size. This russ forms a small tree, often multi-stemmed, and needs little pruning until it reaches the desired size. Phew, that's it for stabilization pruning, but there was a lot of information, so let's recap before moving on. What are the 3 sources of interest that you might want from a tree or shrub? Yes, flowers in spring followed by fruit and berries, or mainly the foliage. And for flowering shrubs, probably the largest group in the garden, what is the key question to ask? The object is to prune immediately before the plant grows its next set of flowering wood, so that you do not lose the next season's flowers. And the key question driving this is, when does it flower? And now we get on to renovation. If the small trees and shrubs in your garden have not been successfully pruned in the past few years, or ever, then you may be faced with a plant that you would like to keep, but is too tall, too wide, too full, or too tangled. In many cases you can renovate a plant, but sometimes the best solution may simply be to replace it and choose another one. And so the question for you is, how do I decide whether to renovate? What is the first and most important question? Well, the first question is, do I like it? There is no reason to spend time and effort renovating something that you don't even like, just because it was in the garden when you bought the house. Will it regrow at all? Remember too, there are some species that are just not good candidates for renovation. In part 1, we discussed how some plants happily produce buds from very old mature wood like this hibiscus, and some do not. Well, it stands to reason that if you're faced with a plant that does not, like lavender in the example, then cutting it back to the ground will simply be the precursor to digging out the stump, instead of watching it spring back into life. Is it worth keeping? Depending on the growth habit of the plant, you may need to retain the central framework, and if this is weak or ugly, you may decide on replacement again instead. And finally, is it in good health? You certainly need a healthy plant and root system to renovate. If there is a lot of dead wood or sign of disease, then the chances of regrowth are much reduced. So assuming that you are going to give it a try, there are 2 ways of renovating a tree or shrub, which I call recovery and regeneration. Which you apply depends on the natural growth habit of the plant you are looking at. It should also be said that the need to renovate may not be entirely down to the gardener or their lack of gardening. Some shrubs simply do not lend themselves to an open shape, and as well as annual stabilization pruning to limit the size, they benefit from occasional more drastic measures, either recovery or regeneration, and we'll look at examples of each as we examine the pruning. The definition of recovery pruning from part 1 was thinning and shortening stems in an overgrown and tangled plant. There are two slightly different approaches. Firstly, for the canopy of small trees and shrubs that form a similar branched framework, and secondly, for shrubs whose natural growth habit resembles more of a thicket of stems, all growing from ground level. Let's take a look one at a time. Firstly, the canopy method. It is easy to see how trees and shrubs lose their open framework over a few years without regular pruning, and the aim of recovery is simply to get back to the shape that we looked at in the formation section, with fewer branches and light reaching all flowering and fruiting wood, as well as reducing the height if you need to. I'm using a small tree as an example, but the process is exactly the same for a shrub. They are really just like a tree with a very short trunk. This apple tree has been kept to a manageable size over the years, and you can see where the upper branches have been pruned regularly. But not so much has been done to preserve the structure in the centre, and it now has several large branches growing through, and if we look more closely, you can see where the main branches, pruned in earlier years, have sent up vertical stems that are now growing straight into the canopy, making it more congested. Some recovery pruning in the coming autumn would restore the shape, open the centre, and maintain the tree in good health for many years, plus the primary objective of an apple tree, to keep it producing a strong crop of good-sized fruits. As with formation pruning, work is done while the plant is dormant with all the leaves off, with the added benefit that you can see the shape much better to decide what stays and what goes. To avoid stressing the plant too much and to minimise the rapid regrowth reaction that can cause long water shoots, the usual advice is to remove up to a third of the canopy in any 1 year. Take out dead, damaged and badly placed branches first, as you would in housekeeping, and then start to even out and open up the main framework. Cut away any overlong branches, again by up to about a third. A two-dimensional diagram representing a three-dimensional tree is always a challenge, but you can see in this picture I have started virtual pruning on the left side to allow space for flowers and fruit, and have shortened the remaining branches without simply hair-cutting round the whole canopy. Of course, the ideal is to prune each year, but even then you will eventually need to do some more major work, where dense clusters of flowering twigs develop over time, to get back to an open, balanced framework. The guidelines are the same as for all other pruning activities. Cut back to a shoot, bud or leaf, and if you are removing a branch, take it right back to the parent. You will be removing a fair portion of the stems that would have borne flowers in the coming season, but by staging the recovery over a couple of years, you will keep some of the display in the fruit. And the end result will be a plant that you can appreciate for many more years. Moving on to thicket-style shrubs, you can see how this young Philadelphus naturally grows a cluster of tall, straight stems with few side branches and just the flowering shoots, and it is not suited to the open centre framework style of a shrub with a single trunk or 3 to 4 main stems. As the plant ages, the stems thicken and more are produced, so that the centre becomes congested, and the oldest stems lose flowering vigour. At this stage, you can remove up to a third of the oldest stems from the centre, cutting them right out at ground level. This allows light into the centre and promotes new flowering stems to develop. At the same time, the remaining shoots can be cut back, again by about up to a third, to a side shoot, bud or leaf, if you need to reduce the height at the same time. Of course, it looks very different when you're actually facing a real plant. You can see the mass of stems on this forsythia and how it has been thinned out significantly as well as the height reduced so that it is kept vertical and close to the fence and doesn't hang out over the grass. There will be new flowering shoots for next spring, and it will probably put on a better display than if it had been left alone. This style of recovery pruning can be done instead of stabilization pruning, i.e. at the same time. It's just a more drastic version of the same, so that you get the benefit of flowering and then the new wood has time to mature for the next year. The other type of renovation is regeneration pruning. In part 1, I described this as more severe pruning to remove much of the top growth and start again. In fact, this is the most drastic pruning that you can do. So, as mentioned before, you do have to know that the plant will respond well. Regeneration has been used for centuries as a woodland management technique. For example, hazel coppice and pollarded willow. It can also extend the life of a tree because the top growth never reaches maturity and old age. It's a very simple approach. When the plant is dormant, you cut it down almost to the ground, which is coppicing, or back to the main trunk, which is pollarding. Let's look at some practical examples. Rhododendrons regenerate well from the base and can be cut back in winter or after flowering in late spring if you want one last display of flowers. They soon reshoot and will take a few years to get back to flowering, but it is definitely worth the sacrifice. As well as pollarding to get a bunch of long stems from a short trunk, there are plants that can be cut back to the main framework, and yew is a great example. This churchyard yew is being regularly clipped, but if it gets out of hand, it can be cut right back to the trunk, because unlike most conifers, yew is able to regrow from live buds within the old wood, and this makes it ideal for evergreen hedging, as well as topiary. There are reasons for regenerating a shrub, even if it is not overgrown and tangled. Cotinus is a good example, as it is less successfully managed by regular stabilization pruning, because it produces a mass of new growth when the growing tip is pruned out, and quickly becomes dense and twiggy. You are really left then with two extremes. Give it enough space to grow to its natural size, or, once the plant is established, cut it hard back to near the base or the central framework every couple of years to stimulate new growth of tall, straight wands. The gardener can then decide whether to thin some of these out and let the plant grow naturally again to a large shrub, or repeat the severe pruning regularly. Both yellow and purple cotinus respond in this way and produce much larger leaves on the regrowth, which are very dramatic when they turn colour in the autumn. Some plants are cut back annually simply to force larger leaves. This Paulonia lends a very tropical air, especially if cut back hard in spring, so that the new leaves exceed well over 30 centimetres long. Other plants are cut down because the young growth is more attractive. The new stems of the dogwood, Cornus alba, and many willows have brighter winter colour and are often regenerated every couple of years for that reason. You can cut back half the plant each time instead in order to preserve the height. And that's the end of the regeneration section. So let's recap. Prune generally when shrubs are dormant. This is particularly important for deciduous plants. Evergreens have a bit more flexibility, but always avoid frosty weather to avoid damage to the new cuts. Cut down to about 15 centimetres from the ground so that you know there are buds to regenerate, or back to the main trunk and framework. And feed and mulch the plant well after pruning. It's going to have to do a lot of growing to recover. And so this is the end of our look at the different reasons and techniques of pruning small trees and shrubs. Remember that sharp tools and rickety ladders are never a good combination. If you can't safely reach to prune any part of the plant, you should seriously consider getting professional help. And there's just time for a review of what you have learnt in this topic before you go for a well-earned tea break. In part 1, I explained the cornerstones of pruning, that is, what you need to know before you even pick up the secateurs. Firstly, why are you pruning? And secondly, how plants react. In part 2, you learned about the 3 pruning techniques for creating shapely and healthy trees and shrubs as they grow to the desired size. Can you remember what these 3 techniques are called? Housekeeping takes out dead and damaged wood. Formation tweaks the shape as the plant grows to form an artistic or open structure. And raising the canopy. This is a type of formation that can be done as the plant grows or once it is a little bit more mature in order to let light down to ground level. And we also looked at why pruning is not the same as topiary and hedge trimming. And in this final part, you've seen how to maintain plants through stabilization so that they do not get out of hand, and 2 ways to renovate them if they do, recovery and regeneration, with the added tip on how to encourage a tropical effect using hardy plants to grow larger leaves than usual. There's more information about how the Gardening by Design box of tricks can help you to plan, plant and look after your plot on the Gardening by Design website. I hope to see you again on another topic soon. Happy gardening!